The primary subject of today's gospel from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13 is that really famous parable of the weeds and the wheat, which is unique in the sense that it only shows up in the Gospel of Matthew, but also because it's the only parable besides the parable of the sower where Jesus explains the thing behind closed doors to his disciples, which is actually really significant. And so the whole idea is that the parable of the weeds and the wheat is not really meant to be this general introduction to the Christian thing, but rather it is meant specifically for people like the disciples, people who have made this really conscious and intentional choice to follow the Lord. And so the whole idea is that for people like them, this is a parable to show them how to cooperate with God's grace to actually become the persons that God is calling them to be. And so to kind of make sure we're on the same page, the story basically revolves around this master who sows a bunch of seed in the field, with the intention of having eventually become this rich field of luscious wheat. In the dark of the night, though, the devil comes and sows the weeds amongst the wheat. The next morning, the servants of the master are all kind of in a panic, right? So they run to the master, they're freaking out at the presence of the weeds amongst the wheat, and they offer to uproot the weeds, like right away. But of course, the master says no. He says no, lest you also uproot the wheat along with the weeds. So what he says is, wait until the harvest time. Wait until a time of ripeness, when these two things will eventually be separated. The wheat will be stored in the barn, and the weeds will be cast into the everlasting fire. Okay, so there's a couple of things I want you to notice here. First of all, this idea that the master in the story is not surprised or scandalized that there's weeds amongst the wheat, which speaks to the fact that God is likewise not scandalized or surprised at the presence of evil or corruption or wickedness in the world, and therefore neither should we. Because the reality is that our time here on this earth is necessarily a time of pilgrimage. It's necessarily a time of spiritual warfare, where we're constantly laboring and fighting against the world and the flesh and the devil. And what this means for us, practically speaking, is that our sense of peace should not depend on the absence of these things. If you're waiting for a time where there is no spiritual conflict, you're going to be holding your breath for a pretty long time. So therefore, our sense of peace should be dependent on something else. It should be dependent solely on the reality of God. There is only one God. He is our Father. He is on our side. And He alone is the master of the field. We don't believe in a sort of yin and yang spirituality where there's two equal and opposite forces of good and evil. Again, there is one God. He is all good. He is on our side. He is our Father in heaven. And more to the point, He alone is the master of the field. Now, the second point might sound kind of similar to the first, but it's actually complementary. So the whole idea here is that the master in the story, he is not worried. He's not afraid. And so despite the presence of the weeds amongst the wheat, he exhibits this extraordinary calm, which speaks to the great confidence of God. And so the whole idea is that God has great confidence that the ability of the good in this world, as symbolized by the weeds, to grow and to flourish, is stronger than the capacity of the evil in this world, as embodied by the weeds, to corrupt and destroy. And incidentally, that's why the Lord says later on in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16, that the gates of hell will not prevail against us. Because we look at that image and we tend to think of it as a defensive thing, but it's actually an offensive thing. So you imagine hell with the gates around it. The whole idea is that the good attacking the gates of hell will eventually prevail. There might be the occasional setback, but what the Lord promises in the context of today's parable is that the good will eventually prevail. The wheat will eventually triumph over the weeds. Now, the third point is kind of the crux of the story in a certain sense. So again, in the context of the parable, when the servants go to the master and they offer to uproot the weeds like right now, the master says no. He says basically, wait for the time of completion, wait for the harvest, wait for the time of ripeness, if you will. And so the whole idea here, in a certain sense, even though it might sound kind of strange, is that more important than the desire to be perfect or pure right away, I need to respect the process. I need to respect the process of development and growth, which necessarily requires me to live in a space of the already but the not yet. To aspire for holiness, to aspire for perfection, but at the same time to be okay with being imperfect right now in the present moment. It's okay to focus on those few things the Lord wants you to work on today and trust that tomorrow is the time to work on other things. To live in that space of the already but the not yet as an important prerequisite to becoming the person that God is calling you to be. So to use an analogy, think of the whole process of writing a term paper. So there might be this desire on some level to come up with the final product right away. But if you think about it, you necessarily have to go through the first draft, the second draft, maybe even the third and the fourth before you get to the final product. And the whole idea is that you can't skip steps. You have to go through the process of development and growth to become, again, the person that God is calling you to be. Okay, now obviously it's one thing to say respect the process, but still I base the question, what do you do in the meantime? Well, in a certain sense, that's the whole point of the other two parables in today's gospel, the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leavened bread. So to kind of walk you through these things one at a time, the parable of the mustard seed is relatively straightforward. So obviously the key image here is the mustard seed, which apparently is so small that if you hold it in the palm of your hand, it can easily be blown away by the slightest gust of wind. At the same time, it can grow into this shrub, which can be upwards of 9 or 12 feet. So you're supposed to key on the hugely disproportionate relationship between what the mustard seed begins as opposed to what it can eventually become. And the whole point, in a certain sense, is that even though the things of God can be easily dismissed for being small and petty and seemingly insignificant, we should not be distracted by externals. We should not be distracted by that which the world finds to be important and valuable, but instead we need to learn to focus on being small, to focus on being hidden, because the Lord delights in that which is small and hidden. Partially because that which is small and hidden is most docile and cooperative with His grace. So think, for example, of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She consents to being nothing so that God might become her everything, right? My soul magnifies the Lord. But secondly, because that which is small and hidden most corresponds to God's very being, which is why He says, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 19, "Let the little children come to me, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And likewise in the Sermon on the Mount, Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs again is the kingdom of heaven." Okay, so that kind of brings us to the third and final parable, the parable of the leavened bread. And so basically this revolves around this woman who mixes in a handful of yeast or leaven into 3 measures of flour to eventually become this leavened bread, which can apparently feed over like 100 people. And the key reference here is this thing which is rendered here as mixes in. And so apparently if you look at the original Greek, the more accurate translation is hides. So this image of this woman hiding deep within this flour, this principle of growth, which of course is the yeast or the leaven, which speaks to the fact that that which is ultimately the principle of growth is something which is hidden deep inside. And so given all that, perhaps we might say that in a certain sense, the woman represents the church. The flour represents our human nature. And what is the yeast? What is the leaven? This represents not just the grace of Christ, but Jesus Christ Himself. And so given all that, the whole point of the parable of the leavened bread in a certain sense is to say this: don't be distracted again by externals. Don't be distracted by what the world finds to be important and valuable, but instead focus on the interior life. Abide in the Lord. Have a serious habit of intentional prayer and frequent the sacraments often. Mindful of the fact that, as we hear in Romans chapter 6, the Spirit which raised Christ from the dead is alive and at work within you. And again in Philippians 1, that which Christ has begun in time, He will eventually bring to completion. Okay, one final point. I'll kind of end with this. So you notice that today's gospel ends with a really harrowing description of the end times. So the Lord says at the end of time, the angels will come, and they will separate the weeds from the wheat. So the wheat, again, will be stored in the barn, and the weeds will be cast into the everlasting fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to notice here with regards to this description of the end times. First of all, it's intentionally supposed to be provocative. Like, there's a reason why you hear this gospel today as opposed to like 15 minutes before you die, right? Because it's supposed to provoke you to a stance of right behavior. So if you hear these 3 different parables and you hear this description of the end times and it moves you to a stance of conversion, that's a good thing. So it's important for us to kind of clarify that right off the bat. Now that said, perhaps there's a couple of things I might tell you about the end times to kind of take the edge off the thing. And so first of all, don't look at the end times as this arbitrary moment where the Lord says, look, I want the world to end basically on a Tuesday at 3. Think of it instead as this very natural, organic coming together of all things. The coming together of the various strands of human history. There's a reason why the Lord describes the end times as the harvest time. It's the moment of ripeness. It's the moment of completion. Again, when the various strands of human history come together in a very natural and organic sort of way. That is the moment when every tear will be wiped away. Everything will finally be shown to have had meaning in retrospect. And finally, everyone will receive their just reward. But you see, the second thing is this. Even though it's true that the Lord clearly calls us to cooperate with His grace, again, to become the persons He's calling us to be, if you break it down, if you look at all three parables that we covered today, the parable of the weeds and the wheat, the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the leavened bread, what exactly is the Lord calling us to do? If you think about it, not that much. So first of all, He's saying, look, don't be scared. Don't be scandalized. Don't be afraid of the fact that there's weeds amongst the wheat, that there's evil and corruption in the midst of this world. Instead, trust that God is sovereign. Trust that He's in control. Trust that He alone is the master of the field. Secondly, don't be distracted by externals. Don't allow yourself to be caught up by that which the world finds to be important and valuable, but instead, love being small, love being hidden. Focus on the interior life. Abide with Christ, receive the sacraments often, have a serious habit of intentional prayer. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly in a certain sense, have great confidence in the Lord. Trust that if you're faithful to doing those few things the Lord wants you to do carefully and well, and you do all these things that we talked about in the context of these three parables, the Lord promises in today's gospel that you'll be counted in time amongst the righteous who will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father in heaven. And again, in the words of today's gospel, let anyone with ears to hear listen. And may God bless you all.